As we turn to works by female modernists and writers of the Harlem Renaissance, we will want to remain attentive to the way the works we read reflect and contribute to a definition of American literary modernism. We look at the work of Edna St. Vincent Millay, H.D., Susan Glaspell in Unit 5. In addition, we'll also make connections between modernism and the Harlem Renaissance by looking at the work of Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and Zora Neale Hurston. Edna St. Vincent Millay's I Being Born a Woman is an example of the many sonnets she wrote. Of course, the sonnet form doesn't seem at first glance to represent the modernist dictum, make it new. Compared to the work of Williams and Eliot, it doesn't seem very experimental. Let's think about Frost as a way of getting into Edna St. Vincent Millay's work. His work draws on tradition in both theme and form, but it also suggests the anxiety and cultural despair of the modernist moment. Remember his assertion that poetry is a momentary stay against confusion. In his poem, the world is a diminished thing. It's a confusing place. There are two roads to take. We're faced with a desire to stop permanently in another poem. And in response, he imposes a regular meter and actively controls perspective and definition to help those of us faced with modernity to keep going. I Being Born a Woman by Edna St. Vincent Millay employs a similar traditional form and elevated language reminiscent of that earlier time that we might think about as a way for her to control the emotions that her speaker is experiencing. We might even say that I Being Born a Woman is a love poem inasmuch as it expresses admiration for a lover, and that's traditional. The speaker tells her lover, I find your person fair and feel a certain zest to bear your body's weight upon my breast. But this poem has a decidedly modern twist in that it offers a female speaker who is trying to gain control of her sexuality and identity. That control is visible in the sonnet form. The first 8 lines, or octave, presents her problem. She is attracted to the man she addresses, but the attraction is purely physical and no more. She tells him, so subtly is the fume of life designed, to clarify the pulse and cloud the mind, and leave me once again undone, possessed. In the last 6 lines, or sestet, she offers a resolution to her problem, and she decides that a past physical encounter doesn't mean she has to attach herself to him. The speaker asserts, I find this frenzy insufficient reason for conversation when we meet again. This is an assertive female voice, and just like that, she takes control and refuses to bow to social convention that she is a fallen woman who must pay for her lack of virtue. So in a sense, I Being Born a Woman is kind of a Dear John letter. A new perspective on female identity is also evident in H.D.'s work, which is represented by Helen. H.D., as you've read in the author footnote, was associated with Ezra Pound's Imagist movement, of which this poem is an example. It is also representative of poems of women writers who re-envision myth. Remember, Eliot does this in The Wasteland, and in that poem it suggests how far we've fallen in the modern period. H.D., however, is doing something else, and I'm sure that doesn't surprise you. While she is also suggesting that something is wrong in our thinking, she isn't trying to make a connection to past cultural or social values. Instead, she calls out the objectification of women, and in particular, the process of othering, which leads to blaming and defining women as negative. In Helen, she draws from the Iliad and the representation of Helen as the cause of the Trojan War. The 3 stanzas at the end stanzas in the poem offer Greece's negative perspective of Helen only, but in the last stanza, she illustrates that Helen has been a scapegoat for the actions of men. There's something else going on here that we can call modernist. Modernism, remember, asks us to reconsider what we normally understand by the center and the margins. This, of course, is a question of power. Both HD and Millay are replacing a male point of view in poetry with a female one. They're putting female perspective in the center rather than leaving it on the margins. Modernism realigns the center of culture, either by reaching out beyond its national or regional boundaries or by reincorporating material that had previously been considered subliterary or marginal. Susan Glaspell's play Trifles does this as well. It would be easy to label Glaspell a later-day local colorist or realist. We see most of the qualities of local color writing: exact detail, local speech and customs, a strong sense of place in her description of the Wrights' rural farmhouse, which is far off the main road. But the demands of the one-act drama, with its single set and mood, its compression in time and use of a limited number of characters, single set, tight plot, they all keep the play from sentimentality and stereotyping, the kind that can be associated with local color, the idealization of character, an emphasis on a unique and colorful aspect of the locale, stereotyping. Okay. So, for Glaspell's work, we can say that this is not a tragedy relegated to small towns. Glaspell uses Mrs. Wright's plight to comment on larger social issues. Notice how the play carefully distinguishes between the affairs of men and the concerns of women. You'll see that in the stage directions where we're told that the men and the women stay apart on stage. The men intrude on Mrs. Wright's world, dirtying her towels, scoffing at her quilting and her preserves. As we move into the kitchen, the men are left out and the awful details of Minnie's life are revealed to Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale, who are there accompanying the men. When the men return, we see how blind they are, and we, the audience, accept the women's decision not to reveal Minnie's motive. A motive that the sheriff and the county attorney desperately need for their case against Minnie Wright. Like the bird, Minnie's voice has been strangled. Figuratively, of course. Like the woman in the yellow wallpaper, Minnie Wright has faced a crisis of isolation, and her creativity has been thwarted. Mrs. Hale tells us, "I wish you'd seen Minnie Foster when she wore a white dress with blue ribbons and stood up there in the choir and sang." In identifying with her, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters come to empathize and protect her. Empathize with and protect her. Lastly, Glaspell puts women's culture on center stage. The title Trifles refers to things of little value or substance. In the play, these trifles are the ruined fruit preserves, the bread that has been left out of its box and gone stale, an unfinished quilt, and a half-clean, half-messy tabletop. Oh, and let's not forget the empty birdcage. But these trifles become the vital details of the case, which are discovered by the women. Unlike the men who are looking for forensic evidence to solve the crime, the women see these as clues that reveal the bleakness of Mrs. Wright's emotional life. They theorize that Mr. Wright's cold, oppressive nature must have been dreary to live with. Mrs. Hale comments about Mrs. Wright being childless. Not having children makes less work, but it makes a quiet house. While chatting to pass the time, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters manage to unveil a psychological profile of a desperate housewife. Unit 5 also includes 3 writers associated with the Harlem Renaissance. By including these writers, I don't want to suggest that the Harlem Renaissance is an outgrowth or a subcategory of modernism. There are lots of good reasons for treating it as its own movement and with a separate agenda and traditions. But it's useful in a survey of literature to examine its connections to literary modernism. Before the Harlem Renaissance writers of the 1920s, most black writing took the form either of the slave narrative of the 19th century, like Frederick Douglass's, or of racial uplift writing of the early 20th century by writers like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. In Visitors to the Black Belt, Langston Hughes provides a two-sided perspective of Harlem. The poem ends with a simple question and answer that resonates with the problem of multicultural communication and representation. The speaker asks, "Who are you, outsider? Ask me, who am I?" In these lines, the poet reminds the reader to ask about the speaker rather than assume he or she already knows everything about that speaker. The outsider's place is outside and should defer to the speaker who is on the inside. To me, it's here in Harlem, Hughes writes. Hughes reminds his right readers not to draw conclusions about Black life without asking him first. In other words, he wants to define himself with also allowing him room to define himself. I, too, takes up the call for self-definition while clearly redefining what it means to be an American. While the Negro speaks of rivers, looks back and makes a connection between the cultural contributions of Africans to American history. Claude McKay's Africa and America are poems that parallel Hughes's I Too and The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Notice how the poems are held together by opposing ideas. Africa's historical accomplishments are presented along with failures. The speaker's feelings for America are both positive and negative. Bridging opposing perspectives is possible in these works because of McKay's attention to social and historical contexts. The cradle of power of Africa is tarnished by the arrogance and fame brought by slavery. And while the vigor of American culture, which McKay likens to a tiger in America, is inspirational, that tiger also sinks into my throat her tiger's teeth. McKay also insists on self-definition, like Hughes. And like Edna St. Vincent Millay, McKay uses tight traditional forms to achieve intensity. We tend to associate free verse, unrhymed, loosely metered verse, with spontaneity and emotional honesty and intensity. But on the other hand, we see sonnets, rhymed couplets, and other traditional patterns as the mark of writers who accommodate to social practices, conventional beliefs, and ordinary values. But this isn't true. McKay's form goes against the content of his poems. In The Harlem Dancer, which you'll see as a sonnet, the speaker objectifies the dancer, imposing a definition of her that seems to go against the way she sees herself. The poem's final couplet makes room for an alternative. Looking at her falsely smiling face, the speaker tells us, "I knew herself was not in that strange place." Here we see a discrepancy between what the dancer does and who she is, between how the audience perceives her and how she sees herself. Before going on to our final writer for this unit, let's refresh our memories about modernism. Remember, modernism seeks to realign the center of culture. Writers like McKay and Hughes, like H.D. Pound and Eliot, do so by reaching out beyond America's national or regional boundaries. But modernists like Glaspell do so also by incorporating material that had previously been considered subliterary. This is the kind of work that Zora Neale Hurston is engaged in with the Gilded Six Bits. Hurston takes certain risks in this story. She steers rather close to stereotypes that have been widely exploited. This is something earlier local color writers did. During the Harlem Renaissance, progressive black writers did not tend to write about the folk living back home in the South. The use of black vernacular was considered to be uneducated, primitive, substandard. Yet Hurston centers her work in Eatonville, Florida, which, by the way, was the first all-black town to be incorporated in the United States. Joe and Missy May seem a quaint and loving married pair. The story opens with a play fight which has become a ritual for them every Saturday night, which also happens to be payday. Joe signals his arrival by throwing gold coins across the threshold of their home as gifts to his wife. They have a house, food, and clothing. Joe has a full-time job at the fertilizer plant, but they are by no means well off financially. Money, more specifically aspirations for more money, come between husband and wife. Having more is represented by Otis Lehmans, an outsider from the north who flashes his money and what it has bought him. Notice how Hurston reproduces the same motif as earlier regionalists. We have an outsider coming in and encouraging change in the local community. And in the pattern of regional stories, we should be suspicious of this change. All that gold that Otis is flashing is gilded, it's not real. Joe inadvertently encourages his wife to have an affair with Otis Lehmans when he tells her he wishes he had Lehmans' riches. Missy May's idea of being a good wife is making her husband happy. And because she observes that he wants money, she devises a plan to get some by sleeping with Otis. Of course, we know that this isn't a good idea, but notice how Hurston neither judges or blames Missy May. She doesn't blame or judge Joe either. In a modernist twist, similar to the one Millay incorporates into her sonnets, we also see a female character who is unconventional and bold in terms of sexuality. Rarely do we see an unfaithful woman in literature who isn't condemned eternally for her actions. Here, Missy May is just as modern as the female speaker in Millay's poems. And unlike many local color narratives, we are never sure whether or not all will be right in the end. We really don't know if they're going to get back together at the end. A description of Joe and Missy May's house suggests the unconventional aspects of the story. And this is the description. It is a mess of homey flowers planted without a plan, but blooming cheerily from the helter-skelter places. Of course, this could also be a description of the marriage, which up until this time has been without a plan, while at the same time blooming. Lastly, Hurston is making an argument for the cultural relevance of the Black South. Unlike McKay and Hughes, or even Eliot, H.D., or Pound, she isn't returning to an ancient or classical era. Trained as an anthropologist, Hurston shows us the creative potential and beauty of vernacular Black American culture. In all these works, we see an expansion of literary modernism practiced by writers like Frost, Eliot, and Pound, and even Hemingway and Fitzgerald, in their attempts to make sense of the world, but also in their attempt to alter and change it. Heeding Williams' advice, they indeed make it new.